This is chapter 13 on the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. And what we're going to see is that chapter 13 covers the spinal cord and spinal nerves, and chapter 14 covers the brain and the cranial nerves. In both, the sensory receptors detect some type of change, temperature change, pain, touch, vibration, and that activates sensory neurons, and that sensory input then is sent through those sensory neurons into the spinal nerves. The spinal nerves then enter into the spinal cord, which is chapter 13, and then they will synapse onto motor neurons that will deliver motor output or motor commands through the spinal nerves out to an effector. We see the same thing in chapter 14 with the sensory receptors, except now the sensory input is traveling over cranial nerves instead of spinal nerves. So in this chapter we're going to be looking a lot at the spinal nerves, and we're going to look at the spinal cord. The spinal cord is 18 inches long. It starts at the end of the medulla oblongata and it ends at L1 and L2. There's 4 different regions to the spinal cord. There's the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, and the sacral regions. The spinal cord is divided into gray and white matter, where gray matter is composed of cell bodies and white matter is composed of myelinated axons. The gray matter is expanded at the cervical enlargement for nerves that supply the shoulder and the upper limbs, and the gray matter is expanded at the lumbosacral enlargement area for nerves that supply the pelvis and the lower limbs. There are 31 spinal nerves. There are 8 cervical spinal nerves, 12 thoracic spinal nerves, 5 lumbar spinal nerves, and 5 sacral spinal nerves. There is also 1 coccygeal nerve. The spinal cord and the vertebral column enlarge at the same rate until about 4 years of age. Then the spinal cord stops growing, but the vertebral column continues. That's why the spinal cord ends around the L1 to L2 vertebrae. The conus medullaris is a tapered end at the end of the spinal cord. And then there's a filum terminale, which is a fibrous end of the dura mater that becomes the coccygeal ligament. So it attaches to the inferior tip of the spinal cord and then inserts into the coccygeal bone. Looking at a cross-section of the spinal cord, we see the posterior median sulcus and the anterior median fissure. There's also a central canal that contains cerebrospinal fluid. There are dorsal rootlets that converge to become a dorsal root on the posterior side of the spinal cord, and the cell bodies of the sensory neurons in that dorsal root form the dorsal root ganglion. There is also ventral rootlets that converge to become the ventral root on the anterior side of the spinal cord. New terminology replaces the dorsal root as the posterior root, and it replaces the dorsal root ganglion as the spinal ganglion. The ventral root also is changed to the anterior root. The anterior and posterior roots pass through the intervertebral foramen of the spine, and that spinal ganglion, or the dorsal root ganglion, lies just between the pedicles of the vertebrae. Spinal nerves are mixed nerves, that is, they're both sensory and motor. They contain both sensory neurons and motor neurons. The sensory neurons are going to enter into the spinal cord through the dorsal root, or the posterior root, and the motor neurons are going to exit through the ventral root, or the anterior root. Together they combine to form that spinal nerve. The cervical spinal nerves exit above the vertebrae, so C1 spinal nerve exits above the C1 vertebrae. Then C2 spinal nerve is going to exit below the C1 vertebrae. C3 exits below C3, etc., until C8, which is the final cervical spinal nerve, will exit below C7. This is how we end up with 8 cervical spinal nerves, even though there are only 7 cervical vertebrae. The thoracic and lumbar spinal nerves exit below the vertebrae. So T1 exits below the T1 vertebrae, L5 spinal nerve exits below the L5 vertebrae, etc. Because the tip of the spinal cord ends at around L1 or L2, the spinal nerves from the lumbar and sacral sections have to elongate to exit their respective foramen. The spinal nerves from the lumbar and sacral sections elongate to form the cauda equina, which means horse's tail. This allows for the lumbar and sacral spinal nerves to exit through their respective intervertebral foramen. The spinal meninges are coverings around the spinal cord. There are 3 layers of spinal meninges: the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The pia mater is the deepest layer, and it attaches to the spinal cord itself. Then there's a small space. Then there is the arachnoid mater, which is the middle layer, and then another space, and then there is the dura mater, which is the outermost layer. The dura mater is a tough, fibrous outer layer that blends to form that coccygeal ligament at the filum terminale. The spaces in between them are the epidural space, which is on the outside of the dura mater, the subdural space, which is in between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, and the subarachnoid space, which is between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. The subdural space is not usually present in a healthy living person. However, subdural hematomas, which is blood, can expand the space, so it is present. The subarachnoid space is filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and the epidural space is where epidural injections are given. The spinal cord has both gray matter and white matter. The spinal cord gray matter integrates information and initiates commands, while the white matter carries information from place to place. The white matter and the gray matter is very organized in the spinal cord. The white matter is divided into 3 regions called columns. Each column contains tracts, which are bundles of similar neurons. The tracts are similar in diameter, myelination, and speed. They relay the same information, sensory or motor, in the same direction. Ascending tracts carry sensory information toward the brain. Descending tracts carry motor information to the spinal cord. The spinal tracts are very specific. The gray matter contains masses called nuclei. Sensory nuclei receive information from receptors. The motor nuclei issue commands to effectors peripherally. Posterior horns contain sensory nuclei, both somatic and visceral. The anterior horns contain somatic motor nuclei, and the lateral horns contain visceral motor nuclei. The spinal nerves branch just lateral to the intervertebral foramen. These spinal nerves and their branches will contain both sensory and motor neurons. The 3 branches are the anterior ramus, the posterior ramus, and the paired communicating structures called the rami communicans. The anterior ramus will contain neurons that will send information to the spinal cord and motor commands out, to and from the ventrolateral body surface, body wall, and limbs. The posterior ramus contains neurons leading to and from the spinal cord, from the skin and the muscles of the back. With the paired communicating structures called the rami communicans, the white ramus communicans contain myelinated fibers, whereas the gray ramus communicans contain unmyelinated fibers that go to and from glands and smooth muscles in the body walls or limbs. Dermatomes are specific regions of skin that are monitored by a single pair of spinal nerves. Shingles is a herpes viral infection that attacks neurons in the dorsal roots and the ganglion. The virus produces a painful rash and blisters that are distributed along the corresponding dermatome. Anyone who has had chickenpox can get shingles. Usually this occurs only once in a lifetime, but can occur more frequently in those that have a weakened immune system, like in the elderly, pregnant, AIDS, or cancer. Here we see a mapping of the dermatomes with their corresponding spinal nerve number. Damage to a spinal nerve produces a loss of sensation in the corresponding dermatome. Peripheral neuropathies can occur. These are regional losses of sensory or motor function, for example, a tingling or a crawling sensation. The location of the affected dermatome provides clues as to the location of where the spinal cord injury was. The more exact location can be determined if motor loss is also present. Spinal nerves form plexuses which form peripheral nerves. Only the anterior rami of the spinal nerves form these plexuses. Neurons from separate anterior rami converge and their nerve fibers blend, producing nerve trunks. The nerve plexuses contain both sensory and motor neurons. There are 4 nerve plexuses. The cervical plexus contains neurons from the anterior rami of C1 to C4. The phrenic nerve is the major nerve in this plexus. The thoracic plexus, otherwise known as the brachial plexus, contains the neurons from anterior rami of C5 to T1. They may also contain neurons from the C4 to T2 anterior rami also. In the brachial plexus or thoracic plexus, the trunks become cords, which then become nerves. The trunks are named by their location relative to the axillary nerve, whether they're superior or inferior or right in the middle of where the axillary nerve is. The median, ulnar, axillary, radial, and musculocutaneous nerves arise from the thoracic plexus. The lumbar plexus contains neurons exiting the anterior rami of T12 to L4. The femoral nerve is the main nerve of this plexus. The sacral plexus contains neurons from the anterior rami of S1 to S4, and the sciatic nerve is the main nerve in this plexus. The nerves that I have named, the phrenic nerve, the median, ulnar, axillary, radial, femoral, etc., they are all called peripheral nerves. The peripheral nerves then will also divide, and the divisions will also have names as well. For example, the femoral nerve from the lumbar plexus will divide, and one of the nerves coming from the femoral nerve is called the saphenous nerve.